Medicare would not pay for it. They couldn't find insurance to cover any aspect of it. If the family tried to pay for this, they would have been out of house. They wouldn't have been able to eat. All of this was falling apart, and we couldn't find a charity or whatever to help them out. In that case, the treatment was kind of doing its job for this patient, but the patient who was conscious at the time, in conversation with the family, as this definition said, the community or the family, determined that it was an excessive expense and burden on the family to continue these treatments. So they stopped the treatments. A few weeks later, the person passed. In full reality of the sacramental system and all the rest. That was an ethical decision. It wasn't something based off of, well, I just don't want to suffer anymore, so just end it all. It wasn't based off of this idea that, like, well, this just is the most horrible thing in the world, just let it end. It was this idea that, like, we would continue this if we could, but literally it's impossible. And I'm not going to sacrifice my family just so I can have an extra couple of weeks of life. And there's a beautiful conversation I had with them. Again, that idea of happiness and the idea that we're stewards of the gift, not owners of the gift. So actually this person was able to live out the end of their life in a more beautiful way by accepting that decision that was perfectly in line with Catholic teaching than if they would have just fought to the bitter end and put their family at risk of losing house and home. So I'd just like to point that out, that we can have those conversations as Catholics. We don't have to, this isn't like an absolutely rigid system that you just have to fit the square into the circle hole and just bash it in until it fits. Because people get hurt that way. We don't want to hurt people. People matter, and we love them, and so we want to serve them. So, again, that's just very basic. There's tons I could say more about that, but at least now you've heard it. And if you have questions about it, you can call me later. Or call the NCBC that has a hotline at all times. I'll give you that at the end as well. So any questions about food and hydration? The same exact understanding and kind of breakdown can be used for ventilation or any other mechanical use of keeping the body alive. Is the ventilator providing what it says it will provide? Oxygen through the lungs to the body. The lungs no longer are working, they don't actually provide oxygen, the ventilator isn't doing what it's supposed to do. That means is no longer necessary. But if in using the ventilator, it actually is helping the person keep their oxygen levels up, and it's fulfilling its finality, we can't just remove it because we're just tired of seeing grandma on the ventilator. Because it's doing its job. It's doing what it's supposed to do. So to do so would be to remove something that we can't remove. It's an ordinary means at that point. But again, all of those things are ongoing conversations. Entering in the hospital, ordinary means. 2 months later, disease has progressed beyond a different point, have the conversation again. 2 days later, disease has progressed to another point, have the conversation again. Is this still ordinary? Is it still something that I think has a reasonable benefit of helping me or not? So that's just important also. Always keep that conversation open. It's important. So for the sake of time and energy levels and the rest, I'm going to basically briefly talk about sedation but not get into the principle of double effects, which is really fun. I love it. It's a fun principle to use, but it's semi-complicated. You have it there before you, and I can give you articles that explain it as well. But the whole idea of end-of-life care. Often it's coming up, you'll hear of palliative sedation. So you've heard the word, you know what it is. All it's talking about is how to care for the person at the end of life who's suffering a lot of pain. Cancer pain, physical pain, whatever it is. And so we give morphine or some other kind of Roxanol, some kind of painkiller at the end of life. But the painkiller can't actually keep the pain to a minimum because the pain's so bad. But the reality of all the morphine and the opioid drugs is that once you give enough, it'll start to shut down the body. So there's like this happy medium you have to find so that we don't kill somebody by giving them morphine. So if someone gets a morphine drip and they think that every time they click it, they get morphine, the reality is that's not true. It's set to you only get so much over a certain period of time, no matter how many times you click it. But there's sometimes a subjective idea, like I'm clicking it, so I feel better. It works. It's helpful, it's good, glad we use it. Psychology is a wonderful thing. But the reality of palliative care is a beautiful gift offered to us through the use of medicine. God's given us the gift of medicine, we should use it well, and especially for those who are suffering at the end of life. But the question comes down to, is the doctor prescribing too much pain medicine just to hasten the person's death? It's a big question to ask. If you're in a situation where someone is getting pain medication and they've gone comatose, they no longer can respond, you need to challenge the doctor with that question. You have the legal right to do so, and I would say the moral responsibility. Because unfortunately, I was in medical school for a year. It's just taught like you just help the person pass. That's loaded language. And if someone's not Christian, they don't know the reality of the dignity of a human being. They don't know about happiness. They don't know about stewardship of life. They don't know any of that stuff. So they just do what secular media says is the compassionate thing to do. So challenge the doctors with that question. Are you giving enough morphine just to treat the pain? Are you giving so much that it's leading my loved one to die? And essentially what that would be called is passive euthanasia. We're allowing someone to give a lethal dose of medication. So I think I just like to equip people with that question and challenge the doctor on it, because the reality is that eventually we are called, like they'll have to give a certain amount of morphine, that it might lead the person to enter into a coma, kind of a medicated coma, and eventually it will lead to the stopping of the organs. But when it's done in a Catholic manner that's okay with Catholic teaching, it's done in such a way that the doctors and nurses are continually checking pain signs. So if your doctor or nurse hasn't come in to check to see if the person's in pain the last couple of hours, ask them about it. Are you giving them more morphine, or do you know they're in pain? Are you treating the pain, or are you just giving them more morphine? Those are just important questions to ask that I think we just need to be equipped to do so. Because unfortunately, I've witnessed the reality of, I didn't know it at the time, this was before I was a priest, but the reality of a doctor who, I don't know if they knew they were doing it, I'm just going to assume the best they didn't, but they just kept pushing the morphine to the lethal point. That's essentially what a physician-assisted suicide is. They give you a lethal dose of opioids or some other drug to help you die faster. Can't support that at all, so we just got to be aware of it. So that's really basic, in basic sense. Is that, any questions about that? We'll have time for questions. The final thing I'm going to end with is just this basic paragraph that's about beginning of life stuff. So I would love to talk about, conception, and I'd love to talk about the beauty of life at the beginning and the fact that we're stewards of our reproductive gifts and not the owners of them, and children are products. They're not something that we are owed, but they're something that God gifts us with. I would love to talk about the reality of the struggle of infertility that seems to be on super rise in our day and age, and talk to those couples who are struggling with it. I have many conversations with couples about that reality, but I don't have time to do that. But I just mentioned all of them so that you at least know that I love to talk about them. And we need to have that conversation open in the Catholic Church, because people shouldn't suffer in silence. So I'm just going to read this real fast, make a few comments, and then we'll end the talk. So the moment of fertilization, the moment that the sperm meets the egg and you got a new human being, a unique human being comes into existence by the grace of God and the cooperation of parents. By the grace of God is important. Even when a technician does this all in a petri dish, God cooperates with that. That human being cannot exist without God's cooperation. So there's no accident. Absolutely impossible for there ever to be an accidental human life. Impossible. Because God has to create that soul out of nothing, out of pure love. Period. Solely the only way possible. Doesn't matter how many sperm and egg come together, it only becomes a human being with God's grace. So we just always have to remember that aspect. So that no child is an accident or unwanted. That single cell then has a unique combination of 46 chromosomes that make it a human being. And that single cell has everything necessary to develop into a human being. It has a unique individual of the human species. One of the beautiful things I'll just mention biologically is the moment that the sperm meets the egg and penetrates the zona pellurosa, the outside part of the egg, the axis of the human body, like the head and the tail and the front and back, is already set. It's one single cell. It actually hasn't even combined to make the nucleus yet, but everything that's necessary to set up the human being is already taking place. That's beautiful. For me in college, when I was studying all of this, it was actually developmental biology, studying how life happens, that led me to understand that the only way that human beings are ever born in the first place is by a miracle of God. Everything that could go wrong is humongous. Like, it's surprised that any one of us actually made it to birth because of all the chemical things that have to be perfectly lined up at the right exact time for us to actually have a spinal cord. Ridiculous. But it happens over and over and over again. Because God is beautiful and wonderful and merciful, and He's created this system to be amazing. So, I think it's just good to remember that at least you've heard a Catholic priest say it for sure, and hopefully you've heard it many times before. Every single human being, every single zygote that's created, whether they're preserved, cryopreserved because of IVF or whatever, they're wanted, they're desired by God, and they have intrinsic dignity, and they're created for the same happiness as you and I. So we need to treat them that way. So that's vitally important. In all the arguments for contraception, abortion, in vitro fertilization, even with gender dysphoria, a man or a woman, and transgender, all those conversations come back to this reality. That moment that the sperm met the egg, all of that was defined for us, not by random happenstance, but by God's divine providence. And so we need to obey that divine providence and learn from it, and not dictate it by our own desires. It's a loaded question, I know, but at least I've said it so we can have that conversation. So, with that all being said, there's plenty more I could go into. The final things I'll say, I've told you about the ERDs. If you want to learn more, basically, here's a good book, and I'll have these downstairs, or you can ask about them later, or shoot me an email, whatever. Biomedicine and Beatitude is the best book on bioethics out today. Very understandable. It's not just a bunch of technical jargon. It's written by a really faithful Dominican priest who does a great job of making tough issues understandable. Gives you tons more history and all the rest. So, Biomedicine and Beatitude by Cantor Pier Giorgio Austriaco. Father Austriaco. That's a better way to name it. This one's the Bible. It's really helpful. Read it. It gives you everything you need for life. Then another one by Janet Smith, Life Issues, Medical Choices. It's just like a question and answer kind of thing for really specific medical questions. Really great book. Very understandable as well. So, Life Issues, Medical Questions. And the final thing I'll tell you, I meant to put it on the little handouts. You'll just have to write it down. NCBC. National Catholic Bioethics Center. Website is ncbcenter.org. Go there, search around. It is literally, you cannot be led astray on that website. Everything on there is approved by the Catholic Church. It's by the best moral theologians in the Catholic faith right now. It's beautiful stuff. So go to the NCBC. They have a 24/7 hotline. You can call or email. So if you have any questions at any point, you can call me, but I'm not that smart. I don't know all the answers. Those guys do. And ladies, both. So please use the NCBC for what it's meant to be, which is a Catholic resource in a lot of difficult questions in the medical world. So with that, the final thing is, I don't know if anybody picked up any of these prayer cards out there in the very beginning. If you didn't, pick them up on your way out. A little bit of a story with these. The reality is God's love is abundant and beautiful. We all know that. We've talked about it tonight with life, end of life, and all the rest. The way that He's calling our diocese to accept His beautiful and abundant love with the permission of Bishop Vinke is to found a religious order in our diocese, for our diocese, of religious women. It's a beautiful grace. There's a lot of kind of story that goes to it, but Bishop Vinke has asked me to kind of help spread this message via these prayer cards. So I ask all of you to, as you leave, we have a box of them here. Take them with you, spread them around, ask people to pray this prayer for the successful founding according to God's will of a religious order in our diocese and for our diocese. So there's tons more, but at this moment, I think the biggest thing is let us turn to God in prayer and trust that He's working a beautiful grace in our diocese. And as more particulars get worked out, we'll kind of work all of that out and let everybody know in the diocese, because it's a beautiful gift, because the special grace that's being called is for the sanctification of priests, holy priests, holy families, holy parishes. We change the world, right? One thing at a time. So, just a beautiful prayer. So we're going to end by saying this prayer together. So if you don't have it, sorry, but you listen. And then pick up your holy cards on the way out. Just entrust ourselves to the divine providence and loving mercy of God. And I do want to just say one thing with this is I know that our diocese has been super well served by different religious orders throughout history. So this is St. Agnes, this is St. Joseph, and especially in this parish, in this area. It's not an either-or thing. God's love is abundant, it's a both-and. We're just asking to fulfill God's will in the way that He makes it manifest. So this is praying for all religious, but most specifically for a foundation of a new religious order to work with and for the entire diocese, including all the other religious that have ever helped us, male and female. So it's just a beautiful way of accepting God's providential love. So let us pray. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O humble and hidden Jesus, grant us a share in the Eucharistic life. We beg in invocations to religious life from and for the diocese of Swan. We ask for victims of your Eucharistic heart, as spoken to Blessed Mary of Trinity, and in the way of Saint Benedict. Most Holy Spirit, inspire women to courageously respond to your spousal invitation, freely giving their lives for the salvation and sanctification of priests. Grant us faithful submission, that we might be utterly conformed to your Eucharistic heart. Full of trust in your goodness, we ask you to purify our response to your most holy and perfect will, that in all things your name may be glorified. Amen. Our Lady of Perpetual Help, pray for us. Saint Benedict, pray for us. Blessed Mary of the Trinity, pray for us. Angels and saints of God, pray for us. And may Almighty God bless you, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you all very much, and I look forward to the question and answer. If you have the energy left for it, there'll be cookies, so that's at least one benefit of coming to the question and answer.
Thank you, Father, for sharing all that with us. I think we can all agree that we're grateful that you went to the 2 years of schooling for all of us. So before you all leave, like Father said, we have a lot of resources available down in the basement tonight in addition to the Q&A. Father mentioned the approved Catholic Advanced Directive and the Healthcare Proxy. We have both of those available forms in the basement. Lastly, Cheryl Carson is going to share with us about a program called Operation Red File. She'll share that in the basement during the Q&A as well. So there are cookies and refreshments, and we want to thank you all for coming tonight, and especially thank you, Father, for your show.